The radio was dead. Had been dead for 3 weeks, ever since the morning she'd accidentally caught a news report about a court-martial in Kandahar and had to pull over at a rest stop until her hand stopped shaking. So now Interstate 5 just hissed with static, white noise that filled the sedan like water, and Megan O'Brien let it fill her because silence was worse. Silence meant thinking. The duct tape wrapped around her steering wheel was peeling at the edges, grey and tired, and she'd been meaning to replace it for 6 months the way other people meant to call their mothers. The highway stretched south toward San Diego with the flat monotony of a desert, and she passed the same billboards every Tuesday, injury lawyers with their megawatt smiles, a tax service run by someone's cousin, a casino that promised life-changing weekends. She noticed the 18-wheeler first. Left lane, 3 cars ahead, tires wearing unevenly on the driver's side, the kind of detail that most people missed the way they missed everything else that was actually trying to kill them. Her eyes catalogued it anyway: tread depth, weight distribution, the probability calculation that ran in her head like background code, automatic and unwelcome. 23 years of habit. She couldn't turn it off anymore. The minivan was drifting too, just barely, the kind of slow drift that meant a driver hypnotized by road noise, and she watched it edge across the rumble strip and back, edge and back, a rhythm that would end in metal and glass if the driver didn't wake up. She did wake up. Megan exhaled. The asphalt was hot. The heat shimmer rising off the pavement in visible waves suggested a temperature somewhere north of 120 degrees, which meant the surface would be tacky, which meant braking distances would change, which meant most people would fail to account for that and would brake anyway when they panicked. She could feel the heat through the windshield even though her air conditioning was set to a temperature just above not actively harmful, and she wore the cold coffee in her thermos like a meditation. The cup was military-grade steel, dented on the bottom from something she didn't remember, and she'd owned it longer than she'd owned the car. She'd owned it longer than she'd been alive as a civilian. The dog tag swung from her rearview mirror, just one, not the pair, and the chain it hung from was broken, frayed at the edges where the original clasp had corroded away. She replaced it with a broken chain every 6 months, kept the original hanging in a box under her bed, kept doing this ritual even though it made no sense because ritual was all that stood between the woman she was now and the woman she used to be, and those were not the same person. The dog tag caught sunlight when it swung, and she'd hung it there exactly 40 minutes before leaving the apartment. Only on Tuesdays. Never on any other day. The small photograph tucked behind it showed a man in dress uniform, hair the color of burnt copper, eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, smiling in that particular way that men smile when they don't know they're about to die. The nursing textbook on her passenger seat was open to Chapter 7. Emergency thoracic procedures. The pages were dog-eared, actually dog-eared, worn from her thumb going over them too many times, the way people handled holy books or photographs of dead children. Her margin notes read more like tactical briefings than study guides: CTA location, 2nd ICS, MCL. Needle angle 90 degrees perpendicular to rib. Listen for the hiss, pressure relief, not air movement. She'd written that last one in her own shorthand, the handwriting still tight and controlled like it had been trained in 30 years ago. The textbook was the 2018 edition, which meant it was 6 years out of date, which meant the emergency procedures had probably changed, which meant she didn't actually need it because her hands remembered better than her brain. Muscle memory took over before thought could get involved. That was the whole problem. She passed mile marker 147 and noticed the smoke. It wasn't visible yet to the other drivers, they wouldn't see it for another 15 seconds, would register it as something already happening rather than something about to happen. But Megan saw it first, the kind of thin grey wisps rising from the shoulder that meant fire was already established, already eating whatever it was eating, already committed to burning. Her foot moved to the brake with the immediate response of someone trained to run toward disaster, and she was already calculating approach vectors, exit angles, the likely number of people in the vehicle versus the likely speed at impact versus the likely survivability curve that plotted outcomes like a graph of mathematics and meat. The minivan with a drowsy driver had crossed 3 lanes to the right, which was why it wasn't the first vehicle to impact the pickup truck that was now tumbling like a child's toy across the shoulder. A Subaru wagon hit it first, a glancing blow that sent it spinning, and then the pickup went end over end with the kind of mechanical certainty that broke things into states where they could not be repaired. The sound was immense, metal on metal, glass like crystalline screaming, the low percussion of an engine block punching through a frame rail. Rubber burned on asphalt. The smell reached her even at a distance, burning plastic, hot oil, the copper-sharp scent of electrical fire. She was already slowing, already pulling to the shoulder, already reaching for the emergency flasher button with her right hand while her left hand was already unbuckling the seatbelt. The sedan wheezed to a stop 40 meters from the wreckage. Around her, other drivers were slowing, were already reaching for their phones, were already performing the calculus of American roadside psychology. Was this their problem or someone else's problem? Was stopping a legal liability? Would the insurance company raise their rates? She moved before the mathematics finished. Her nursing shoes, worn white Saucony sneakers held together with the same kind of duct tape that wrapped her steering wheel, hit the asphalt with sharp slaps. The heat was immediately overwhelming, pressing down like weight, like something with intention. Her scrubs were already warm, the pale blue fabric clinging to her skin as perspiration began to bloom across her shoulders and lower back. She moved through the traffic anyway, through the cars that were already stopping, already creating a scene, and they saw her in the scrubs and didn't try to stop her because there's something about a nurse running toward disaster that tells other people not to interfere. The pickup truck was a Chevy, once, maybe early 2000s, red faded to rust red, and it was now a crushed geometric nightmare. The frame was folded like paper. The engine block had punched down through the floorboards. The cab was compressed to a space that shouldn't have fit anything with a human shape. But there was a human shape inside it, and the human shape was moving. Conscious. Alive. That changed everything. She reached the driver's window, which was now at hip height because the entire truck had been folded in half. Inside, an Army Ranger was trapped in the wreckage, his face already slick with blood, his chest heaving in the kind of shallow rapid breathing that meant one of two things: pain or something was wrong with the lungs. Pain, she could work with. The lung problem was the one that killed people in the 7 minutes before an ambulance showed up. "Can you hear me?" Her voice came out steady, the way voices did when the training took over, when the muscle memory of command superseded whatever panic might be lurking in the background. He nodded. The movement caused blood to well up in his mouth, and he spat it onto the crumpled fabric of his uniform. The name tape read web in faded block letters. E for or E5, probably, based on the sleeve, hard to tell with the uniform torn like that. "I'm going to need you to not move. Don't talk. Just breathe." She was already assessing, already cataloguing. Left shoulder crushed, probably. The way he was positioned in the seat meant the steering wheel had pinned him. The way his breathing was shallow and rapid meant his chest was compressed, which meant his lungs couldn't expand, which meant he was becoming hypoxic with every breath. She ran back to her sedan and popped the glove compartment. Inside, insurance documents, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a knife. Not medical grade. Not intended. Just a knife she'd taken from her kitchen 3 months ago without thinking about it, without planning anything specific, the kind of knife that people carried for reasons they didn't articulate. It was a tactical folding knife with a blade that was maybe 3 inches, serrated on one edge, sharp enough to cut through the dense rubber seal of an industrial freezer or a person's sternum if someone knew how to make it do that. She knew how to make it do that. The paramedics would be 12 minutes out. She'd heard it on the dispatch scanner on the Subaru driver's phone as she ran past. 12 minutes. In 12 minutes, tension pneumothorax would graduate from treatable to lethal, would graduate from a thing a person could survive to a thing they couldn't, and she'd watched people graduate through those categories before, had watched the exact moment a patient's eyes went from present to absent, and she'd never forgotten it. She moved back to the driver's window with the knife in her right hand, and when the ranger saw the knife, his eyes went wide with something that might have been fear or might have been hope. She didn't speak. She just moved the fabric of his uniform out of the way, found the correct rib space by feel, located the intercostal gap with the precision of someone who'd done this in a sandstorm under mortar fire, and pressed the blade through. The hiss of air escaping came first, the sound of pressure relief, a 3-second exhalation of compressed air that had no other way to escape. Then blood. Not much. Just what the wound itself produced, which meant the knife had found the space between the ribs rather than the rib itself, which meant the needle thoracotomy was going to work. What? He started to say. Tension pneumothorax. You're drowning in your own collapsed lung. I just gave you air. The words came out in the flat, clinical tone of someone reporting to a superior, not someone explaining to a trauma patient. Your breathing should improve in approximately 7 seconds. 7 seconds passed. His breathing deepened. The panicked rattling in his chest eased. Color came back to his face, just slightly, just enough to tell her that his brain was getting oxygen again. His name was Webb, and he was still alive, and he was still trapped, which was the next problem that needed solving. She couldn't get him out of the truck, the compression was too total, the angle too twisted. But she could reach his legs, and she could feel for the femoral artery with her fingers, could find the pulse point at the inside of the thigh, and when she pressed her palm against it, she found blood flowing hot and urgent beneath the skin. Bleeding. Internal or external, she couldn't tell from outside the wreckage, but the fact that the pulse was that strong meant the body was still fighting, still oxygenating, still trying to stay alive. Stay with me, she said. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a command with a weight of rank behind it, and something in Webb's eyes responded to it even though he didn't know what rank she was, didn't know anything about her except that she'd just stabbed him with a knife and it had worked. She pressed her palm flat against the femoral artery, keeping pressure there, feeling the pulse beat against her hand like a second heartbeat. The blood was warm and then it was cooling because she was already in shock, already his body was shutting down the peripheral circulation to keep the brain alive, and she needed to maintain pressure on that artery until someone with actual equipment showed up to take over, until the medical infrastructure could engage, until the professionals arrived. She didn't let herself think about what would happen if they didn't. The sirens were still minutes out. She could hear them in the distance, but distance was a deceiving thing on highways. 2 minutes? 3? The smoke was thicker now, and the Subaru driver was standing next to her, pale, useless, just watching. Other people were calling for ambulances that were already called, already dispatched, already en route. She ignored them. She kept her hand pressed against Webb's femoral artery, kept pressure steady, kept her breathing even, kept the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. The dog tag in her rearview mirror caught sunlight from 100 meters away, swinging in the heat shimmer like something alive. The fluorescent lights of Seattle General hummed their electric complaint as Megan stepped through the employee entrance on day 3, her badge clipped to her scrubs just below the dog tag on its broken chain she'd never quite managed to leave at home. The hospital smelled like every hospital, antiseptic layered over something organic and suffering, and her body responded with muscle tension she'd spent 6 years trying to unlearn. The ER was already chaos at 6:36 a.m. Ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. A trauma patient from a motorcycle accident was being prepped in Bay 3, and the morning shift had that particular friction of people who hadn't slept enough and cared too much. She clocked in, grabbed her assignment sheet, and tried to disappear into the machinery of the place, just another contract nurse whose hands worked steadily and whose eyes never met anyone's for longer than necessary. Dr. Raymond Caldwell was already in the ICU when she arrived for morning rounds, his white coat pressed like a threat and his silver watch catching the overhead lights with the kind of intentional gleam that came from people who believed objects reflected status. He was reviewing a patient's chart, Mr. Everson, 72, recovering from an MI, and when Megan scanned the medication orders for the shift, her breath caught. Metoprolol dose listed as 5 milligrams, intravenous, which would bottleneck the man's heart rate to dangerous levels for someone in Everson's condition. His baseline was already compromised. The 5 milligrams would likely trigger cardiogenic shock. She approached the med cart, waited for the clinical moment when Caldwell was between consultations, and spoke quietly, barely above a whisper, the kind of voice that wouldn't carry, "Doctor, the Everson order. I think it should be 0.5 milligrams, not 5. Standard post-MI protocol." She didn't frame it as a correction. She didn't say he'd made a mistake. She offered it like a collaborative suggestion, the way you were supposed to when you were a contract nurse with barely 2 years at a facility where the chief of surgery had already proven he could make your life difficult. Caldwell smiled at her. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that looked like a predator recognizing prey that had just announced its location. "Good catch," he said, loud enough for the medical students on rounds to hear. Then he turned to the resident beside him and repeated it, "Residents, never miss a dose like that. The contract staff are really catching details today." He corrected the order himself, accepting the credit, and told Megan to see me after rounds in a tone that made every person within earshot understand this wasn't an invitation. It was a command. The supply closet where he pulled her aside at 9:33 a.m. was narrow enough that when he closed the door behind them and positioned himself between her and the exit, she could smell his cologne mixed with coffee on his breath. The space was barely wider than a single file, shelves of saline bags and glove boxes pressing in, fluorescent light casting everything in a sterile white that made his face look like something carved from marble. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to maintain eye contact, and she understood immediately that this was deliberate, the confined space, the physical positioning, the use of her name in the tone he'd chosen. He was creating an environment where she had nowhere to stand that didn't put her at a disadvantage. "You're a contract nurse," he began, his voice dropping so low that she had to lean fractionally closer to hear him clearly, "with barely 2 years at this facility." He paused, letting that sink in like a blade. "And I will have your credentials suspended by Friday." His jaw was tight, his eyes flat and clinical like he was diagnosing something in her. "You don't understand how things work here. I have colleagues on the state licensing board. I have 20 years of reputation, dozens of attendings who owe me favors, relationships that go back to my fellowship. You have nothing." He stepped closer. The space became smaller. "That little correction during rounds? That was you questioning my judgment in front of residents. That's insubordination. That's a documentation issue. That's a pattern if I choose to make it one." Megan took one measured breath through her nose. Her hands wanted to tremble, she could feel the trembling waiting in her fingertips like something alive, but she kept them perfectly still at her sides. Her voice when she answered came from someplace deeper than thought, from the part of her that had already survived things that made this closet seem like nothing. "I understand exactly how things work, doctor." She held his eyes. Didn't look away. Didn't soften. Didn't back up an inch even though every cell in her body was screaming to create distance. "I'm going on break." He didn't move. For 3 seconds, long enough to be a statement, neither of them moved. Then he stepped aside with the slow deliberation of someone who was used to people flinching, and when she passed him, she didn't brush against his coat. She walked out of that supply closet like she was walking out of a room where nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. And Caldwell was already recalibrating his attack, already moving through the stages of escalation that people like him understood instinctively. The social humiliation had failed because she hadn't flinched. So he was moving to stage 2, the institutional weaponization, the careful methodical use of the systems that people had built to protect themselves. She found out at 11:16 a.m. when the overhead PA system crackled to life during the shift change. The sound of it, that hollow electronic clearing of throat that meant hospital-wide announcement, made the entire ICU pause. Medications were set down. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The voice that came through was clinical and administrative, "Nurse Meggie to administration." Nurse Meggie to administration. The name hit her like a fist. Meggie. Not Megan. The diminutive she'd heard only from her father and from Daniel, her late husband, in the soft quiet of a life that was supposed to last longer than it did. That Daniel was supposed to be alive for. A childhood nickname, the kind that was meant to be tender, now weaponized and broadcast across the entire hospital floor so that every nurse, every resident, every patient's family member within earshot heard it and understood that someone was being publicly summoned, publicly diminished. Publicly marked as someone who needed correction. She felt her hands on the medication cart. Felt the smooth plastic beneath her fingers. Felt the moment where the room seemed to tilt slightly, where her breathing wanted to accelerate into something faster than normal. She stood there for 4 seconds, just 4, and then she moved. Her feet walked toward administration. Her body followed the protocol. Her face showed nothing. The written reprimand that Caldwell handed her in the administration office was 3 paragraphs long. The language was clinical and precise, unauthorized medical recommendations beyond the scope of practice, failure to respect chain of command, unprofessional conduct. His signature was already dried at the bottom of the page, blue ink that looked like it had been waiting for her. She read it once. Then she read it again. The words were constructed carefully enough that they weren't technically a lie. She had made a recommendation, it had been about medication, and technically she had suggested something to a senior physician, but they were arranged in a way that made her look like someone who was dangerous. Overreaching. Insubordinate. "You'll need to sign," the administrator said quietly, and she could see sympathy in his eyes. He was a decent man named Voss who'd worked in hospital administration for 14 years and had seen this particular pattern before. Megan signed her name in the space provided and felt something shift in her chest, not breaking, but settling into a different configuration, the way bone settles after a fracture. The parking lot reprimand came that evening as the incoming night shift was arriving, cars pulling into spots and nurses emerging with the dazed expression of people who'd just woken up and were about to work 12 hours in a place where people were suffering. Caldwell found her at her car, of course he found her at her car, of course he'd timed this for maximum visibility, and his hand landed on her shoulder with the casualness of someone who'd never been told not to touch people without permission. "Brian," he said, loud enough that 6 nurses and 2 residents turned to look. "Effective immediately, you're reassigned to overnight triage. We're setting up a parking lot immunization tent for the flu clinic, and we need someone to handle intake and documentation. You start tonight at 10 p.m. The parking lot immunization tent. The graveyard shift. The literal and figurative exile from the ER where she'd been doing actual medical work, where she was useful, where there was actual possibility of making a difference in whether people lived or died. Now she was being moved to a tent in a parking lot at night, checking boxes and taking vital signs on people who were walking into a hospital parking lot of their own volition. It was the institutional equivalent of being told to disappear. One tear, just one, escaped from her right eye and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't gasp. Her breathing didn't change. She wiped it away with the back of her hand and looked directly at Caldwell, her voice coming out like still water over stone. "I've survived worse men than you, doctor." He smiled, that predator smile again, and turned away while checking his phone, a gesture of dismissal, of victory, of someone who believed he'd already won. But his hand was shaking slightly as he scrolled, and Megan noticed it with the clinical precision of someone trained to observe the smallest physical details. The trembling wasn't fear. It was rage. The particular rage of someone unused to resistance from people he believed he'd already established dominance over. He'd expected her to cry. To argue. To beg. To show some visible break that would confirm his rightness about her being someone he could neutralize. Instead, she'd stood there with tears on her face and delivered one sentence that was steady as a pulse. And that scared him far more than any argument could have. What happened next would begin 3 days earlier, in the moment after the MPs had escorted her from her sedan and placed her in their command vehicle while the Army Ranger named Webb, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, his dog tag had read, was being loaded into an ambulance with her blood still on his chest, with her hands still shaking from the field thoracotomy, with her doing everything she could to remember that she was supposed to be invisible, supposed to be erased, supposed to have disappeared 6 years ago and never surfaced again. The monitors were screaming. Seattle General's ICU smelled like ozone and fear, that sharp electric tang that hit the back of Megan's throat the moment she stepped off the elevator on day 3. The ventilator alarms hadn't stopped screaming for 30 seconds. Her hands knew that sound. Her hands knew what it meant. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb's blood pressure was dropping like a stone down a well. The monitor read 62/38 and falling. His oxygen saturation had collapsed from 94 to 87 in what looked like 90 seconds flat. The color had drained from his face the way it drained from dying soldiers, a gray-white that wasn't natural, that said his body was shutting down one system at a time. Megan was restocking the supply cart in the hallway when the alarm cascade started. She knew the sound. She knew the rhythm. She moved without thinking. Dr. Caldwell was already at Webb's bedside, his hand hovering over the monitor, his eye scanning the vital signs as if the numbers might tell him something different if he just looked long enough. His jaw was tight. His breathing had changed, shallow, fast, the respiration pattern of a man calculating liability instead of treating a patient. "What happened?" Caldwell's voice came out thin. "Not worried. Careful." The kind of careful that meant he was already thinking about lawyers. The ICU attending nurse, Patricia, 7 years at Seattle General, steady as a surgical light, was already moving. Pressure drop started 3 minutes ago. O2 sat followed. "I'm getting a portable chest X-ray, but the pericardial friction rub appeared on exam about 5 minutes before the decompensation began. I think—" "We don't know anything yet," Caldwell interrupted. His fingers were already on his phone. "I'm calling cardiothoracic. This is outside my scope." Webb's pressure read 58/35. Megan stopped walking. The supply cart wheel squeaked as momentum carried it forward without her. She watched Caldwell's thumb hovering over his phone screen, watched him typing a message instead of moving, watched him make a decision with the kind of clinical precision that had nothing to do with the man whose heart was failing 6 inches in front of him. Outside, San Diego traffic hummed on the streets below. Inside this room, a trained Army Ranger was dying because a surgeon was afraid. Megan had been here before. Not in this room. Not in this hospital. But in a field surgical tent in Sanjin Valley with mortars landing close enough that the shock waves shook before stands, with 14 soldiers bleeding out and only her hands and 2 combat medics and a prayer that would never get answered. She had learned in that moment, learned in blood and salt sweat and the smell of copper and fear, that hesitation was a death sentence you gave to someone else. Webb's pressure dropped to 54/32. "Step back, doctor." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It came out of Megan's mouth in a register she hadn't used in 6 years, low, command-voiced, the tone of someone who had ordered people to move and watched them obey because they understood that obedience kept them alive. Caldwell's phone hand froze mid-air. Megan was already moving past him, already pulling the procedure cart with a single smooth motion, already calculating the angle and the entry point. Her hands weren't shaking. Her breathing was even. Her focus had narrowed to the essential, Webb subxiphoid angle, the trajectory through the pericardial sac, the 200 cubic centimeters of blood that was compressing his heart and suffocating him 1 second at a time. "I need an 18-gauge needle on a 10 cubic centimeters syringe, and get me a chest tube tray to the bedside," Megan said, her voice the same clipped cadence she used to use for combat surgical briefs. The words came out like commands because they were commands. "Patricia, I need you to position him at 30 degrees and keep those vitals coming. If his pressure drops below 50, we're going for emergent thoracotomy." Patricia didn't hesitate. Neither did the resident standing in the corner. They moved because her voice made it obvious that hesitation wasn't an option, that she wasn't asking permission, that she was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Caldwell stepped back. There was something in his expression, something between confusion and rage, but Megan had already committed to the procedure, her hands already finding the angle, the needle already sliding toward the subxiphoid space where the pericardial sac lay stretched and taut and full of the fluid that was crushing Webb's heart. One breath. The needle went in. The angle was perfect. First attempt. The kind of perfect that shouldn't have been possible for someone who hadn't done this in 6 years, but muscle and bone and the neural pathways of combat don't forget. The needle found the pericardial space the way a key finds a lock. The syringe plunger drew back. 200 cubic centimeters of blood-tinged fluid filled the barrel. The hiss of air escaped as Webb's pericardium decompressed, and his monitor alarms stopped their screaming. The numbers changed. Pressure climbed from 54 to 72. Then 88. Then stable at 100/60. Oxygen saturation rose from 87 to 94. The rhythm steadied to a normal sinus pattern that looked like something drawn by a machine that believed in order and survival. "Tamponade secondary to delayed bleed," Megan said, stepping back from the bed, her voice professional and level. likely from initial thoracic trauma. Immediate decompression was indicated. He'll need imaging and probable operative intervention, but his pressure is stable for transport. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that lives in operating rooms after someone does something impossible. Patricia's face had gone pale. The resident was staring at Megan's hands like they might suddenly begin glowing. Caldwell was still holding his phone. Webb opened his eyes. His head turned slightly toward Megan, and he tried to speak, something that might have been gratitude or confusion or just the instinctive recognition that someone had pulled him back from the edge of a cliff he hadn't known he was standing on. "Rest," Megan told him quietly. "You're going to be fine now." She turned away from the bed and began documenting the procedure with the same precision she had used to perform it. Pericardiocentesis. Time. Fluid aspirated. Vital signs response. All of it written down in the clinical language of someone who had performed this procedure before, somewhere, under circumstances that the chart would never capture and that would never need to be explained. That was when Caldwell's phone made the sound of a message being sent. Megan glanced up. Their eyes met across the narrow space of the ICU room. His expression had changed. The confusion was gone. So was the rage. What remained was something colder, calculation. The look of a man who had just witnessed something he couldn't ignore and had already decided how to weaponize it. He typed something into his phone. Then another message. Then he turned and walked out of the room without speaking to anyone, without checking on Webb, without acknowledging the intervention that had just saved his patient's life. Patricia moved to Megan's side. She started, but Megan shook her head slightly. "Just take good care of him," Megan said. "He's going to need continuous monitoring and cardiothoracic follow-up. Make sure someone reviews that imaging the moment it's available." "Where are you going?" Patricia's voice had dropped low. "Supply tent," Megan said. "I was reassigned this morning. Immunizations and flu shots. Apparently I'm overqualified for anything involving actual patients." But she already knew what was coming. She could feel it the way soldiers feel artillery incoming, that pressure change in the air that said something was about to explode. Caldwell had seen something in that procedure. He had seen someone operate with a precision and authority that didn't match a contract nurse with 2 years at the facility. He had seen Major Megan O'Brien instead of whatever harmless version she had been pretending to be. The problem was, he had no idea what he was actually looking at. That afternoon, a formal incident report was filed with the nursing board. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Practice without appropriate credentialing. Insubordination. The words were clinical and precise, designed to be devastating without being obviously personal. The board would have to act. The hospital would have to investigate. And somewhere in that investigation, questions would start getting asked about the ranger named Webb, about the emergency that had required immediate intervention, about where exactly a floor nurse had learned to perform pericardiocentesis with the precision of a trauma surgeon. Megan knew how the next few days would unfold. She had seen men like Caldwell before, men whose power came from institutional position rather than actual competence, men who understood that the only way to maintain control was to destroy anyone who revealed their limitations. He would make phone calls. He would build a narrative. He would do everything he could to ensure that Major Megan O'Brien disappeared again, this time permanently. But she had also learned something in those combat surgical tents in San Jin, something she had tried to forget for 6 years. Sometimes the only way to survive was to stop hiding. Sometimes the only way forward was to let the truth detonate, consequences and all. She was in the parking lot immunization tent when Patricia found her at 4 in the afternoon, the canvas structure smelling like disinfectant and the particular defeat of temporary assignments. "You need to see this," Patricia whispered, handing her a folded piece of hospital notepaper with her own handwriting on it. "I left it in your locker this morning, before I knew what was coming. But now I really mean it." Megan opened the note. For words, in Patricia's careful handwriting, he's building a file. "Be careful." She folded it again and put it in her pocket, next to the single dog tag on its broken chain, the only piece of her past she had allowed herself to keep. The metal was warm against her ribs, warm from the proximity to her heartbeat, warm like a small fire that refused to go out. That was when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she hadn't heard from in 6 years, from someone whose voice still lived in her nightmares. * We need to talk. Your situation has escalated beyond local parameters. Call this number. It's secure. **. The Pentagon. They were watching. They had always been watching. Megan looked out at the parking lot where the afternoon sun was starting its slow descent toward the Pacific, where normal life was happening in the hospital behind her, patients healing, surgeries being performed, the ordinary machinery of medicine grinding forward. She had tried so hard to be part of that ordinary world, had given 6 years to the fiction that Major Megan O'Brien could disappear, that a nurse named Megan could just exist in the margins and survive. But she had just performed a combat procedure in a hospital in San Diego, and she had done it perfectly, and now everything was about to change. She dialed the secure number. Someone answered on the first ring, as if they had been waiting for her call, as if they had been watching the exact moment when the invisible woman became impossible to ignore. The secure line had gone dead 17 minutes ago, but Megan could still feel the weight of that silence, the kind of silence that meant decisions were being made at levels she couldn't see. She sat in her locker area, staring at the name badge clipped to her uniform, watching it catch the fluorescent light like something already disposable. The rain outside hammered against the hospital's loading dock doors with the rhythm of a countdown clock she couldn't stop. Dr. Caldwell didn't wait for Monday. The incident report appeared in her file on Thursday afternoon, dense with institutional language that made her emergency pericardiocentesis sound like a power grab dressed in surgical gloves. Unauthorized procedure. Breach of protocol hierarchy. Concerning pattern of overstepping professional boundaries. Each phrase was calibrated to land exactly where it needed to, not at her clinical skill, which was undeniable, but at her presumption. At her audacity for thinking she belonged anywhere near a critical care floor. She read it in the break room while other nurses pretended not to notice, their eyes flicking away the moment her gaze lifted. The report concluded with a recommendation: recommend immediate suspension pending investigation and consultation with State Nursing Board regarding credential suspension protocols. That same afternoon, Caldwell made a phone call to Dr. Marcus Halloway, his former colleague from Johns Hopkins, now sitting on the State Nursing Board's disciplinary committee. Megan didn't witness the call, but she heard about it from Patricia, the charge nurse, who'd overheard the conversation through an open office door. Yes, exactly what I'm concerned about. No formal emergency medicine training on record. Yes, I'm documenting everything. The board should be notified within 48 hours. Caldwell's voice on the hospital's internal line had carried the certainty of a man feeding information to allies, building something methodical, something that would survive even if she fought back. The interview started Friday morning. Caldwell's administrative assistant scheduled them strategically: nurses who worked Megan's shifts, techs who'd watched her move through the ICU, respiratory therapists who documented her vital sign requests during Webb's crisis. He met with each of them in his office, behind closed doors that seemed to stay sealed for exactly 30 minutes per conversation, his questions narrowing like a surgical blade. Did she discuss her military background with you? Did she ever mention her previous training? Did you observe her violating established protocols? Did she ever indicate dissatisfaction with the nursing hierarchy? He wasn't asking for volunteers, he was building a case, one statement at a time, each person leaving his office looking slightly smaller, slightly complicit. Patricia refused to sign the statement he prepared for her. Megan learned this when Patricia found her in the supply room at 11 p.m., pressing her back against the shelves with the kind of exhaustion that came from choosing integrity over career safety. He wanted me to say you were overconfident, Patricia whispered. That you didn't respect the chain of command. I told him to write his own fiction. Megan placed one hand on Patricia's shoulder. Thank you. It won't matter, Patricia said quietly. He's already decided. By Monday, Caldwell's decision manifested in a printed memo, typed in that clinical Arial font that made institutional cruelty look administrative. Effective immediately, Megan's access to critical care floors was revoked pending investigation. Her assignment, parking lot immunization tent, evening shift, 7 days a week. The tent where volunteers administered flu shots to walk-in patients, where the work required no critical thinking, no judgment, no presence that might threaten anyone's carefully constructed hierarchy. The reassignment was designed to be degrading, not by cruelty, but by displacement. She moved from a place where her hand saved lives to a place where she administered vaccines to people who didn't need saving. The message was clear: you are not clinical staff anymore. You are apparatus. You are mechanism. You are nothing. She filled the tent's vaccine cart on Tuesday afternoon, watching the rain begin to fall in earnest, that Pacific Northwest rain that felt like it came from inside the clouds themselves. The thermometer on the tent support pole read 53 degrees. Wind rattled the canvas. 2 patients came in the entire shift, an elderly woman who asked where the real nurses were, and a teenager who seemed confused about why a woman with trauma shears still clipped to her pocket was administering his vaccination. That's when she saw the envelope in her locker. Wednesday morning, 6:27 a.m., before the sun had properly considered rising. An envelope the color of hospital administration, sealed with that particular weight that meant finality. Inside, a termination letter on Seattle General letterhead, signed by Dr. Raymond Caldwell, countersigned by the hospital's Director of Human Resources, Margaret Kim, with a notation that a meeting was required at 8 a.m. sharp to discuss the terms of separation and severance obligations. The language was precise: Nurse O'Brien's employment is terminated effective immediately, based on a documented pattern of protocol violations, unauthorized procedures, and fundamental misalignment with institutional standards of practice. The State Nursing Board has been notified of the termination and will proceed with their own investigation regarding credential status. This action is taken in the best interest of patient safety and organizational integrity. At 7:58 a.m., Megan sat across from Dr. Caldwell and Margaret Kim in his office. The desk was positioned so the light came from behind them, leaving his face partially shadowed, a classic power positioning, the kind they taught in management seminars about psychological domination through spatial control. He slid the termination letter across the desk's polished surface with the satisfied precision of a man eliminating a problem. "You understand this is effective immediately," he said, his voice carrying that particular texture of a victor addressing the vanquished. "You'll surrender your badge, your access codes, and your locker key. Security will escort you from the premises. Margaret has prepared your final paycheck. It includes 2 weeks severance in exchange for a non-disparagement clause." Margaret Kim looked uncomfortable, a woman simply executing protocol, her eyes never quite meeting Megan's. Caldwell continued, reading from the prepared statement with the cadence of someone who'd rehearsed. "Given the State Board's investigation and the institutional liability your actions have created, we've determined that your continued employment poses an unacceptable risk. HR will provide information regarding COBRA continuation for your health insurance, though given your circumstances, I suspect you'll be seeking employment elsewhere. Somewhere more aligned with your capabilities." He paused. And then, off-script, his voice dropped lower, more personal. "You should have stayed in your lane, Meggie." The use of that nickname, the one from childhood, the one he'd broadcast across the PA system 2 weeks earlier, was designed to break her. She felt it land in her chest like a detonator, felt the rage building behind her sternum, the same rage that had kept her conscious through 36 hours in San Jin, through mortar fire and blood, and the moment Daniel stopped breathing on the surgical table beside her. She felt the tremor starting at her fingertips, the physical response to a threat that wanted her submission. But she'd spent 6 years training herself to convert rage into stillness. One measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from having survived worse. When she spoke, her voice came out like still water, flat, cold, without tremor or break. "My lane has always been saving lives, Doctor. I'm sorry that threatens you." She stood, unhurried, and removed her badge. The lanyard made a soft clicking sound against the desk. She placed her access key beside it. Margaret Kim's jaw tightened, a small acknowledgement that something had just shifted in that room, that the power dynamic Caldwell had constructed was somehow still insufficient to break the woman he'd been so carefully dismantling. "You'll clear your locker under security supervision," Caldwell added, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Megan turned toward the door. She didn't look back. 2 days later, she stood at her late husband Daniel's grave in the rain. The cemetery sat on the edge of San Diego, overlooking the valley in a way that Daniel would have appreciated: open sight lines, high ground, nowhere an enemy could hide. His headstone was simple granite, the inscription reading Captain Daniel O'Brien, U.S. Army, beloved husband. The rank was slightly incorrect, he'd made major posthumously, but the stone had been ordered before the promotion was official, and she'd never corrected it. Some inaccuracies felt like they should remain. The rain soaked through her blazer, the only professional clothing she owned and now completely useless. The single dog tag on a broken chain hung from her neck, Daniel's, not hers, because her own had been turned in on the day Major Megan O'Brien ceased to exist. She held it in her fist, and the edges cut into her palm hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she whispered to the granite, to the ground below it, to the military intelligence officer who'd given her the order to disappear. "I failed to stay invisible like they ordered, and now I've lost everything we sacrificed for." The rain hammered down like forgiveness she didn't deserve. She remembered the day that officer had come to her in the hospital, not while she was still Major Megan O'Brien, Army Medical Corps, attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, but while she was still covered in blood from the classified operation that had gone catastrophically wrong in Sanjin. The operation where they'd lost their entire command structure to what would later be called an intelligence failure, though she'd never learned the details. "You need to disappear," the officer had said, his face carrying the weight of orders from people even he couldn't question. "The operation was compromised at levels we're still investigating. Your name is a liability. Your existence is a liability. You take a civilian identity, you never use your rank again, you never serve again, and you never surface. For national security. For your own protection. Do you understand?" She'd understood. She'd also understood that Daniel was already gone, lost on a routine medevac flight from Bagram to Landstuhl, a mechanical failure that had nothing to do with her decisions. Understanding that she'd watched her husband die and then been told her entire life was a national security liability had seemed like something she could survive. She'd survived worse at that point. But she hadn't survived invisibility. She'd only postponed the cost. Her phone buzzed. A text from Liam, her 17-year-old son. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk." She stared at the message, unable to compose a response, unable to explain that she'd failed at the one thing she'd promised herself she'd succeed at: staying hidden, staying safe, staying small enough that no one would look too closely, that no one would ask questions, that no one would demand more than a nurse could give. The rain continued. The dog tag cut deeper into her palm. And in a hospital 17 miles away, a shadow box was being carefully placed into 17-year-old hands, finally given permission to carry the weight his mother had been hiding. The federal investigators arrived on a Thursday morning in November, moving through Seattle General's corridors with the deliberate precision of people holding a warrant. Sarah Chen from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division carried a leather satchel containing 7 years of Dr. Raymond Caldwell's surgical records, every complication report, every post-operative revision, every document he'd filed with the state medical board. She didn't need to search for the inconsistencies. They were there in the margins, in the timestamps that didn't align, in the patient outcomes that shifted between his handwritten notes and his official submissions. 38 complications reports altered after the fact. Numbers changed. Dates modified. A pattern so systematic it suggested not carelessness but calculation. The hospital's compliance officer, a woman named Margaret Williams who'd worked under Caldwell's authority for 8 years, sat across from Chen's team in a conference room on the administrative floor. Her hands trembled as she opened a filing cabinet containing 14 malpractice settlements, each one paid from discretionary hospital funds without board approval, each one accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement signed by families who'd lost their loved ones. 6 of those families had lost sons, daughters, parents whose deaths Caldwell had reclassified in his official reports as expected outcomes, despite chart notes clearly suggesting hemorrhage, medication error, or inadequate monitoring. The settlement amounts ranged from $180,000 to $420,000. Caldwell had personally approved each one. Chen's forensic accountants traced the money backwards, hospital funds routed through accounts Caldwell controlled, signatures forged on wire transfer authorizations, a decade-long pattern of using institutional resources to bury institutional failure. One settlement from 2018 involved a 42-year-old woman who died during a routine valve replacement under Caldwell's care. Her family received $310,000 and a legal agreement forbidding them from speaking about the death. The official records listed her cause as cardiac complications during surgery, expected outcome. The chart notes read excessive blood loss due to suture technique error. Surgeon did not respond to perfusionist's warnings. The state medical board received Chen's preliminary findings on Friday morning. By Saturday, Caldwell's license suspension was finalized pending investigation. By Monday, Seattle General's Board of Trustees voted unanimously to terminate his privileges, protect the hospital from institutional liability, and authorize legal counsel to review his entire surgical history for potential criminal referral. The colleagues who'd played golf with him every Thursday, the administrators he'd leveraged to threaten Megan, the surgical residents he'd mentored, every single one recused themselves from the proceedings. Caldwell showed up to his office on Tuesday morning to find his keycard deactivated. The door to the chief of surgery's suite had his nameplate already removed, replaced with an interim director's name. A security guard waited by the elevator, holding a folder containing his termination papers and the legal stipulation that he could retrieve personal items from his office only under direct supervision. He tried to argue. His voice cracked on the second sentence. The security guard, a woman with a face like polished granite and forearms like steel cable, gestured toward the elevator without speaking. He made phone calls from his office while the guard waited. His colleague on the state nursing board suddenly didn't return messages. The hospital administrator sent a terse email declining to comment and copying legal counsel. The surgical residents he'd mentored stopped answering calls entirely. His wife of 19 years filed for separation when the local news ran a 15-minute segment on the malpractice settlements, her lawyer citing emotional abandonment and irreconcilable differences regarding professional ethics. Their daughter, a medical student at UCSD in her second year, changed her last name, dropped him from her emergency contacts, and informed the admissions office that she was on her own financially moving forward. The weapon Caldwell had crafted, institutional investigation, credential review, strategic phone calls to allies, had been turned against him with the systematic efficiency of a scalpel. But unlike surgical steel, this blade didn't cut clean. It sawed. Over weeks, his medical license revocation moved from suspension to permanent termination. Federal prosecutors opened a preliminary investigation into fraud. The American College of Surgeons opened a separate ethics inquiry. Every single institution he'd leveraged to destroy Megan O'Brien now used its resources to dismantle him entirely. He realized too late that attacking someone who'd already lost everything meant she had nothing left to protect except the truth, and the truth, once released, moved through institutional channels like a virus through an immune system that finally recognized the threat. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, recovered enough to walk with a cane and cleared for civilian outpatient care, visited Megan at the small two-bedroom apartment she shared with Liam in a neighborhood near the waterfront. His chest bore a scar that mirrored the damage from Sanjin, a surgical wound instead of a combat wound, but a wound nonetheless. He sat on her kitchen table, the furniture was minimal, functional, the decoration non-existent, and told her something the hospital records didn't contain. During his cardiac tamponade, Caldwell had deliberately delayed the consult. Had hoped the complication would resolve itself naturally. Had wanted to avoid the scrutiny that an emergency pericardiocentesis would trigger. Webb had heard Caldwell tell the resident to observe and monitor while Webb's oxygen saturation dropped from 92 to 84 to 71, his blood pressure collapsing toward arrest, his heart compressing under fluid pressure that would have killed him in another 5 minutes. He was going to let me die, Webb said, and Megan understood that Caldwell's cruelty wasn't personal, it was structural, the inevitable result of a man who valued position over people. Webb reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was solid, warm, the grip of someone who'd learned to recognize other survivors. You didn't just save my life that day on the highway. You saved it again in that ICU. The state medical board's final letter arrived in December, certified mail, heavy card stock with an official seal. Caldwell's medical license revoked permanently. The grounds, 3 cardiothoracic procedures performed without proper board certification, falsification of complication reports, and concealment of patient safety incidents. The final irony arrived in the same envelope, an offer of employment. Seattle General's Human Resources Department, citing hospital policy regarding terminated physicians, offered Caldwell the position of night security guard. Minimum wage. No benefits. No pension. No path to reinstatement. The form required his signature to acknowledge the offer, with a blank to indicate acceptance or refusal. He signed it. What other choice remained? 6 months later, Megan O'Brien stood in her new office at the Seattle VA Medical Center, the blinds drawn against the spring afternoon, the single dog tag on its broken chain now displayed on her desk beside a framed photograph. In the photograph, Liam, 17 and standing in dress uniform, pinned her oak leaf insignia on her collar while tears ran down his face, and she stood at attention, because the Army had formally restored her rank, apologized for 6 years of forced invisibility, and requested her return to active service in a command position. She declined the active commission but accepted the rank restoration and the civilian leadership role that came with it. The office overlooked the emergency department where she'd already implemented trauma protocols that reduced critical patient mortality by 18% in the first 4 months. Residents competed for rotations under her supervision. One of them, a second-year resident named Mitchell who showed promise with emergency procedures, had asked her last week about the dog tag on her desk. She'd told him the truth instead of deflecting. Sanjin, 2017, she'd said. 36 hours. 17 Rangers walked out because my team kept them breathing until extraction. Mitchell had written the words in his notebook, underlining them twice. Staff Sergeant Webb worked 3 floors up in the patient advocate office, his recovery complete except for the scar on his chest, identical to the scar on Megan's wrist, both of them marked by the same moment on Interstate 5-6 months prior. They didn't speak about that day anymore. They didn't need to. The scar was enough. Across the city, Raymond Caldwell checked IDs at the night security desk of Seattle General, his medical license revoked, his salary $18 an hour, his shift running from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Colleagues walked past without acknowledgement. The administrator who'd voted to terminate his privileges passed him twice a week without making eye contact. His daughter didn't call. His wife, now ex-wife, lived in Tacoma with a divorce settlement that left him with the house, the debt, and the silence. Megan didn't visit. Didn't gloat. Didn't even acknowledge his existence, the worst punishment she could devise for a man who demanded recognition for 2 decades. On Tuesday afternoons, she drove Interstate 5 in a newer sedan with windows that actually worked, passing the mile marker where she'd pulled over 6 months prior. She no longer kept the dog tag hidden in her purse or stored her medals in her son's closet. She wore them openly now, the way soldiers do. The way she was always supposed to. She kept a photograph in her office of her combat surgical team in Sanjin, 7 soldiers in blood-stained fatigues, exhausted and alive, standing in front of a surgical tent while dust swirled around them. When residents asked about it, she told them the truth. That she'd led that team for 36 hours straight without sleep. That they'd operated on 17 wounded Rangers during sustained enemy fire. That 5 of them had not made it home. That the other 2 were in private practice now, still alive, still operating, still saving lives because Megan had taught them how. The final Tuesday of spring, she was teaching a field thoracotomy procedure to a class of VA residents, showing them how to locate the 2nd and 3rd intercostal spaces, how to open the chest without hesitation, how to massage the heart until rhythm returned. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd learned medicine under mortar fire. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd been responsible for keeping 17 Rangers breathing when nothing else was working. She ended the demonstration by looking directly at each resident, making eye contact, the dog tag visible at her throat now, no longer hidden, no longer something to apologize for. Power is not a title, she said, and several residents wrote the words in their notebooks. Power is the ability to help. Through the window of the VA hospital, 200 miles away, a figure in a night security uniform stood in the lobby of Seattle General, checking the ID of a visitor, an elderly woman who'd come to see her grandson admitted to trauma. Caldwell didn't look up. Didn't see Megan standing at the VA podium, already turned toward the next patient, the next student, the next life that needed saving. She'd already moved past him completely. We appreciate every one of you watching. Please hit like if you're enjoying this, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and leave a comment telling us where you're tuning in from.